So thanks everybody for joining us. This is the Medical Device Playbook for May the 11th, 2021 on balancing human factors, discovery, and compliance. As we get going here, tell me a little bit about who we are and why we do this. What is a Medical Device Playbook? It's so we've been running these conferences for about 5 years. For years, they were live events in Vancouver and Toronto, and this is an example of kind of what they look like. Big rooms full of people, screens, speakers flying in, everybody shaking hands. Seems a little bit shocking. And hopefully we're only months away from having such a thing again. Either me looking younger, talking to some people, and so we actually, at the beginning of COVID, we actually started doing these things virtually. And lo and behold, we started getting more people showing up to the virtual ones and from farther afield. And it was actually a very wonderful thing. So we've been doing them every month now instead of once a year. And they've been really interesting, successful. And let me tell you a tiny bit about Starfish Medical. We're a medical device development services company covering North America. I'm based in Victoria and Toronto, Canada, with staff in California and Boston and other fine medical device places. And we've been doing it for 21 years, 22 years this year. So with about 170 staff. So we're actually one of the larger companies in the industry. We tend to work for companies that you would recognize and some of them that you wouldn't recognize because they're startups. But maybe you'll read their stories about being acquired by the big guys at some point. And the things that we design, we care a lot about how they interact with people, what they look like, and also a lot about the technology inside. And I won't get into any detail. Just give you a bit of context, the kinds of things that we work on, so you'll understand. So as we get into the talk today, the agenda we have 3 presentations for you, and then there'll be a Q&A. The whole thing is 90 minutes long. And so if you would like to add any questions, there's a Q&A tab. You'll notice in your interface, if you just go in there, you can ask questions. And then when we get around to that portion, I believe we can also vote them up if you see a question you like. We're trying out that feature today for the first time. And so let's get into things. So we have 3 very interesting presentations, real wonderful diversity of experience and expertise. And so by way of introduction on human factors generally, a lot of people see human factors ever since that's ISO standard, IEC 62366 came in. They see human factors as a necessary thing, maybe somewhat handy. What we're going to try to do today is convince you of the depth and power of human factors and how it's actually, although required, it should have been something you've been doing all along, and you should do it for its benefits. And we see the benefits in 2 main categories of areas. One of them is in, the discovery part, the formative, as it's called, and the other largely in the summative. But there's other pieces as well, and our speakers will talk about some of that with you as well. I'm getting some echo here. If somebody can mute. So that is the broad introduction. So our first speaker is Dr. Virginia Lang, who is a PhD in human factors and cognitive psychology from State University, New York in Binghamton. She has 30 years of experience in the field. She worked with the U.S. Air Force on cognitive factors affecting visual displays. She's had roles with Bellcore, Symantec, Microsoft, Merck. So a lot to do with human interface. Since 2014, she founded and operates the Herland Institute for Human Factors in Carlsbad in London. And she works a lot with large multinationals, but also a lot with startups on 510Ks, MDRs, and CE mark applications. So Virginia is going to talk about why human factors is good business.
What I want to do is set a goal today, and that is to show you how human factors processes can reduce time and financial costs of getting a medical device cleared or approved. And this doesn't make any difference what country you're in, what notified body you have. It doesn't make any difference. Okay. I am going, okay.
See the next slide?
So one of the major things is that people don't actually know what human factors is. And if you look in the regs and the standards, they'll interchange human factors and usability, and they admit that, okay? But you have to be smart about this because they are two different entities. One is going to deal heavily with your design process, and that's how humans are going to use it. It's based on human behavior, cognition, and physiology. The physiology piece, many of you know as ergonomics, okay? The human behavior and cognition is the sensation, perception, whether person uses the device as you intended or the way they want to use it. The role usability plays, though, is that's the evaluation piece. That's the testing. And you can do formative testing, you can do summative testing. There's also a lot of different formative methods, and we'll go through some of those in just a bit. And so basically, when you have to, as a manufacturer, as an innovator, you have to balance three main things. One, your patients that are going to be ultimately treated by or use this device. Dollars, how much does it cost to get this to market? And a whole raft of different regulations, etc. And now with Brexit, we now have a new set. We actually have a situation where the UK for the next couple of years is still going to take the MDD, and so now you have a third entity. There's a third entity of notified bodies, etc. But you have to balance all of these three, and it's not easy. So if we were to take just a simple user needs example, and it's such that you want to build something that is a receptacle that can hold water and that it can be used to water plants. Those seem pretty simple. And this is what you could come up with. So ergonomically, the handle works, fits in a hand. It does pour water and it does hold water. The only thing is you're going to get very wet if you use this particular watering can. But the thing is that you complete it, you listen to all the user needs, but the right receptacle did not occur. This is so very, very important to understand that user needs is not just an engineering capability, it's also how the person views, thinks, and eventually is going to use whatever your device is. I'm going to talk to something. It's basically a medical device product life cycle. We all know what it is. And you can call it different things, different names, but you're going to start out with feasibility, you're going to have design, you're going to have development, you're going to have verification, V&V, you're going to have process validation, you're going to have commercialization. At each one of these steps, and I think you get the slide, so you'll be able to get the link to this particular thing that I'm talking to. There's a couple of different things, though. They all hinge upon use-related risk, or use FMEA. Human factors, you'll hear people saying you have to do a summative test. Yes, you do, okay? And that's explicit in the standards. What's implicit in the standards is that you have to do formative work. What else is explicit is that you have to have a usability engineering file. And why do you have to have this? The reason you have to have this is that throughout the cycle, you have to show that your design has reduced the use risk as far as possible. So I often get from people, well, there were this many use errors. What do I do? Well, you have to look at the use error with respect to what the severity and what the probability of occurrence is and what the corresponding risk is. If the risk is very low, there might be a mitigation, but that may not necessitate your having to incorporate that mitigation in this design, in this particular design at this particular time. However, on the other hand, you may find use errors that are associated with that have not been found in the original use-related risk analysis, and when evaluated, tend to be very high. You have to put in a mitigation, and then yes, you have to reevaluate if that mitigation is effective. So understand, you don't pass or fail a human factors test. What you do is you have to demonstrate that the use-related risk has been reduced as far as possible, and that this device is going to be safe by the intended users in the intended environment for the intended purpose. This particular screen shows, again, another type of development cycle, different terms, but still the same idea. And basically, the reason you want to do formative work is inexpensive. It has low risk, it has lower costs, it has lower use of resources, and you can evaluate several different types of designs. But if you get to the summative, the end, and you have to do your summative and you've done no formative work, you run a huge risk of having to redesign, a huge risk of having to do things. One of my earliest clients came to me and said they had to do a summative test. The FDA had said that in order to get their 510K approved, one of the things they had to submit were results from a summative test. And we went into the lab. I looked at the device and I said, when we got it, and I said, do you realize there's A, B, and C wrong? And she looked at me and she said, what do you mean wrong? I said, well, they are just not going to meet ergonomic standards. They're not intuitive in terms of what you're going to do with this, how you're going to use this device. And she said, well, we still have to test. I said, okay, fine. First person came in, could not use the device, and that was a patient. Second person, and she said, well, that's a patient. Second person came in, it was a nurse. She couldn't use the device safely and effectively. And she looked at me and she said, are you sure we got the right participants? I said, well, we get another nurse next. And sure enough, the next nurse couldn't do it. And I looked over at her because I was actually doing the observations behind the window, and she's crying. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, you don't understand. I have thousands and thousands of these devices all ready for shipment. If this doesn't pass the test, I have to throw them out. I said, well, that may be what you have to do. I said, you may have to take a loss on this. To make a long story short, those original devices are still in her warehouse, but she has had the improved devices out on the market for a long time. Don't wait, okay? This is the relative costs of putting either a PMA or a 510K out in a device. If you look at what the lighter blue is, those costs, the costs for human factors could come out of there. They are less than 0.0001%. Okay? That's a very small cost if you're doing it in the right time and you're doing it and you're using all of your resources at the right time. Okay, you're doing formative testing, you're doing summative testing. This is so these are ballpark figures of what these different process tests and evaluations would cost. Do you do all of these? No, not necessarily, okay? There are some things where only an expert review is necessary because the device is very ergonomically heavy. And as a result, there are standards that you can actually measure your device against. One of the internationally known standard is the Mills standard for ergonomics. And it is used to, look at pressure, hand grip, different types of ergonomics. And if your device meets that and you have an expert review, you've done the formative testing, okay, or a formative evaluation. Can you then test it with a certain amount of, let's say it's a surgical device. Can you then test it? Of course. You would do it in a formative test. Surgical devices are sometimes more difficult because you'll have to either maybe use a wet lab, a simulated environment that may not meet the stress of what the actual environment would be, or you have to do it in conjunction with a clinical trial. My caution to you is if you're doing things in conjunction with a clinical trial, in terms of the FDA, you need to get permission from the FDA to do your human factors testing in parallel. In other words, I'm not talking about the preclinical human factors testing. I'm talking about concurrent, okay? But it can be done. They just want to know that that's what you're doing, okay? So what happens? At one point in time, I was in academia, and one of the Langisms was there are trade-offs in life. Don't do anything, okay? And you get to the end, and I just saw this happen with a client 2 years ago. They got something from the FDA. They'd done a pre-sub, and the FDA said they did not have to do any type of human factors testing. I was surprised. I said, okay, fine. We won't do human factors testing. Well, what happened? They had complaints. They had a number of different accidents, they called them, okay? But it turned out that they eventually had adverse events and they had to pull the device off the market completely. When they were registering their adverse events with the FDA, et cetera, someone at the FDA said, why didn't you do human factors testing? And they said, well, here, it was told to us, and they showed them, and they said, oh, but our recommendations aren't binding. So understand what is binding are the guidances, but sometimes when you do a pre-sub, you have to be very careful and really understand what the consequences are of not doing a human factors testing or any other advice that's being given to you. So remember, there are going to be trade-offs in life. So what I'd like to, hopefully what I've driven home to you is that human factors is a means of saving costs, time, and money. It's a way to demonstrate that you have built the right product for the right user, for the right environment. In other words, it meets all the regulatory requirements. And it's a way to build safe, effective, and profitable products. It's not just another hoop to go through. It really is very effective. Our industry for medical devices is highly regulated, and so we're required to. But other industries, such as the automotive industry, believe it or not, NASA, space, etc., they're not required to do it, but it's part of their whole process. You wouldn't think, the automotive industry would not think of putting a automobile on the market or a new feature that has not gone through human factors testing. Now, whether all humans can use it, that's debatable, but they still have a process that's ingrained. We are very regulatory centered in medical devices, but please look at it not as a hoop, but as a way to getting a good, safe, and effective product on the market. And that's what I have. And I guess, am I handing it back? Who am I handing it back to, Christine?
You're handing it back to me. Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks so much,
okay.
Virginia.
Scott.
Okay, we're getting it. So thank you so much, Virginia. So you can mute and sign off, and we'll get on to our next speaker, and we'll call on you when we get to the Q&A section.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Bryant Foster, another very interesting person in the field. He has his master's in applied psychology from Arizona State University, 2012. He worked at Google X and user UX research for a number of years, and then he's spent 8 years at Research Collective in Arizona, where he's the VP of Human Factors and User Experience. He works on things like surgical instruments, combination products, home use devices. He's also a co-author of a book, Humanizing Healthcare, Human Factors for Medical Device Design, which is put out by Springer. And so very interested in hearing his stories, and I believe he has a case study for us as well. So Bryant, I see you're still muted, so maybe try say something.
Here we go. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
All right.
Perfect. It's all yours.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Scott. And yeah, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you folks today, and grateful for Starfish for the opportunity. And I really like what Virginia said, and many of the things that I want to talk about will really build off of what she's started with. So really appreciate her discussion of how human factors, when implemented early and throughout the design process, really can make the whole process easier when it comes to your regulatory submission, and ensuring that those individuals intended to use your device can indeed use it as you intend them to. Start off with a quote here. It's easy to make things hard. It's hard to make things easy. For anyone who has built products before, there are so many things to consider, just technical things that, in order to make it work, to do what you need it to do, then kind of thinking about, okay, how do we make this actually easy for the person using it? That is a whole nother part of the process that can, often be forgotten, or maybe just not thought of systematically, methodically. And so that's some of the stuff I want to talk about today, to make sure that that end user, the person who will be using the product, is considered just like the other very important engineering and design components that are going to go into this particular product. So the goals of, and these are goals of human factors, but really they're goals of design and development in general. When we're making products, we want to make them first and foremost useful. And for medical devices, of course, they have to be safe. For automobiles, they have to be safe as well. But when we're thinking about medical devices, we really have the people using our devices and products have increased opportunity to potentially hurt themselves or hurt others. And so they obviously have to be safe. When we talk about being useful, they have to do what they are intended to do. If 3 times out of 10 it doesn't work, it doesn't work as you plan for it to work, well, it's not that useful of a product. And then on the right, it needs to be usable. So if, again, it could work great, it could work every single time as you want it to, as long as the people using it use it as they're supposed to. And when, let's say, 3 out of 10 times they don't use it as intended, well, that's just as bad as it being unusable for other reasons, technical reasons, 3 out of 10 times. So it needs to be usable. And lastly, and maybe not lastly in terms of importance, but it should be desirable. And this kind of combination of factors are important in all devices, all products. And if you think about early computers, this really this model really can be looked at and seen within some of our lifetimes, how they went from being useful to being usable and now desirable. You know, early computers, early personal computers were useful. They did great things, but they weren't always usable. You know, I know even when I was a kid, I never thought I would learn how to use computers. That was something that, you know, my brother, more of a techie kind of nerdy guy, he was into that. But to me, that was complicated. You know, all that had to go into was just very difficult. And now they've become a lot more usable, and they've gotten to the point now where they're desirable, and they have status. They carry status with them depending on the type of computer you use, or, you know, type of phone you use now. You know, that says something about you, and so this is a process that a lot of products go through. When we talk about usable, as we're kind of focused here, that we would consider that to be easy to learn, efficient to use, easy to remember, meaning that if we use it one day and then don't use it for a little while and come back to it, it's easy for us to remember how to use that product. And then error resistant or tolerant. So meaning that if we do make an error, well, that doesn't lead to you know, something that we can't recover from, and making the process of getting back from an error simple and straightforward. This will largely echo things that Virginia talked about, but the benefits of human factors are hopefully improve safety and patient outcomes. We're going to get better task performance. We may increase sales if our product is known through, you know, product reviews or other. Those are, you know, huge now with the reviews, and everyone can write a review on the internet. That might lead to, you know, people seeking out our product, whether they're medical professionals or individuals just in the general population. It's going to be good for brand image. You know, if you got a product that's difficult to use, that can actually hurt brand image. And lastly, you know, it really can aid development and the regulatory approval process. And we'll talk about that some here. So as has been mentioned, the government regulations or guidelines have really kind of stolen the show, if you will, in human factors for medical devices. And rightfully so. You know, these are important documents that have been carefully considered, and they are focused very much on safety, as they should be. The government agencies and regulatory standards committees, their primary goal is to keep people safe. And so when designing medical devices, they want to ensure that you know, just like they would be safe from a technical and engineering standpoint, that they would also be safe when placed in the hands of the user. And so the FDA guidance has been released in 2016. IEC 62366 is the international standard. And these documents focus largely on the culmination of human factors efforts, and that is the summative study for everywhere outside the US, and the FDA uses the term validation usability testing. And but it really is kind of, if you think about whether it's summative usability testing or validation usability testing, it is that final usability study with your final device, all of your final instructions that you kind of place that create that usability study and ensure that people can use the device effectively. Now, as we talked about early on, creating an easy device that people can use effectively, you know, it takes effort, and that's what we're going to talk about now. And the effort that we go through to get to having a usable device is through what are called, you know, formative usability studies. So a couple of things that are important to remember is human factors is not just applying checklists and guidelines to device design. You know, Virginia talked about that when she mentioned the scenario of the flower pot or the watering can. You know, if you just kind of applied some checklists and guidelines about how people are shaped and how they work and how they think, well, you might end up with a product, but it might not be the right product, right? We got to actually put it in their hands and see what they do with it and make adjustments along the way. We can't just use ourselves as a model. If we were doing that, you know, we've all seen this probably before. You know, if an engineer is designing a product or creating a product, for other engineers, well, that, they can really make some shortcuts and use some shorthand. But if that has to be used by my grandma, at home without the help of her healthcare provider, well, some of that shorthand and things that are very commonplace for the engineer are just not going to work for her. It's not just usability testing, and that's what we're going to talk about here in the next little bit. Usability testing, as Virginia mentioned, is one method, and that requires us to have an actual product to have people use and interact with and determine can they use it. But there are all sorts of methods that are incredibly helpful in getting to actually the part where we actually have a product, and other ways to evaluate the product aside from just usability testing. And it really isn't just following the regulatory guidance. I think if we just followed the regulatory guidance, we would end up in the situation that Virginia's client was in, and saying, okay, well, we have to run this summative usability study. We have the product. Let's run it, get that checkbox checked, and move on. Many of us have seen that really just doesn't work often. It does take a little bit of effort in the design process to get a product that can actually pass the regulatory guidelines. So the human-centered design approach is what these regulatory guidance documents have adopted. It's nothing new. They didn't, I kind of like joking with people, the FDA didn't invent, or IEC, they didn't invent human-centered design or human factors. These things have been around for years and implemented in a wide range of fields. But they've just taken it and said, okay, for medical devices, this is the process that we want folks to go through. And it really starts with understanding who the users are and the tasks they need to complete through exploratory research, designing the product, and then evaluating the design that we've come up with to see if it truly meets the user needs, and they can use it effectively as they would or as they might in the real world. And lastly, for medical devices, post-market surveillance is incredibly important, because to think that we could kind of in this sterile environment of the engineering lab and then usability testing, where it is fairly sterile, to think that we would just catch everything is a little bit naive. Once that device hits the market, and I'm in Arizona where it's 110 degrees regularly in the summer. I don't know what that is in centigrade, but it's hot. And so there's going to be new things that potentially come out that we might not have gotten if we designed this product in Canada, let's say. So just that real world experience is going to help us understand, okay, what happens when people have this in their actual lives. And so formative testing is occurring throughout this process. And these formative studies early on are designed to help us understand what product to design. And then in the evaluative stage, they're to tell us, okay, are we designing the right thing? Here are a list of some valuable research methods in both the kind of exploratory and evaluative research phases. So the exploratory might be, literature reviews, where that's not even a true study where we're bringing people in or going observing people. It might just be seeing, okay, what is out there? What other types of devices are being used? What does the academic literature say about certain, things we might be interested in? And reviewing those things and coming up with design requirements for our product. We might interview people, go out, or see them in their natural environments and talk to them, and do things like contextual inquiry. That's where we're actually going out. We've gone to several surgical suites throughout our time, and seeing how surgeons and the technicians and the nurses are interacting together and with certain devices. And that's incredibly helpful. We just never would get that through just asking them questions, for example. So kind of using these methods appropriately in the time that we have, and it can be really influential in helping us come up with what should we design. What is it that they are doing now, and where is the white space that we could create a product that's going to meet their needs and give them something additional that they don't have now. Some other things that we'll talk about, focus groups have been used for years, and they have some limitations, right? We get a group of people all together and get them talking. Well, you got this group dynamic now, and maybe we're only hearing from one of those people. But hey, getting 5 surgeons all together and having them bounce ideas off each other is an incredible useful tool if we're trying to figure out what types of things we could be designing for them. Another important thing is looking at and performing a task analysis. So when we often get involved with groups, that's where the first place we start. What are the tasks that your users, the people using your device, need to complete? And it isn't something that I would say they know completely. They know generally, well, they need to unpackage it and they need to set it up and then they need to use it. Well, those are huge steps that might include tens and sometimes even hundreds of steps in between that are critical. And everywhere along the way there, if a user makes an error or gets confused, it could derail the whole process. And so really understanding and breaking down those tasks can be important in helping us understand, okay, what type of device and what type of information do they need along the way to help them complete each of these tasks. If we move over to the evaluative research, so this is the type of research we're doing once we do have a product and we want to see if it delivers on what we want it to deliver on based on what we know from our exploratory research. And so this includes usability testing. And we do this as early as possible using prototypes, 3D printed prototypes. I mean, prototyping has become so easy now and inexpensive. It's wonderful to see the types of research we can do quickly and just I'll give an example here in a little bit, but just using simple prototypes to ensure that we're moving in the right direction is really helpful. Another one would be a label comprehension study. So if we want to see if our labeling itself, the instructions, if they make sense, if someone were to read our instructions, would they use our product safely and effectively? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Eye tracking as well. So eye tracking has been around for years, but I really see an opportunity to implement this more in device design and use it for understanding and seeing from the user's perspective those things that that they attend to and things that they might ignore. And it's incredibly helpful when seeing this over a few participants, 3, 4, 5 people. If you see some patterns and things that are grabbing their attention, are salient, and those things that maybe they're just not paying attention to, and maybe thinking about, okay, do we need to make things more recognizable, or man, why are they paying attention to this thing that we just didn't expect them to at all? What do we need to know about this? Why is this so important to them? And lastly, the pre-summative study, which it's often called, but it's really kind of the study that you might do if you're designing a product and you learn for the first time, okay, we've got to do this summative usability study, but it also says we should do a formative study. So a lot of groups come to us and they say, hey, do we need to do formative study? What do we need to do? And the answer is no, you don't have to do formative studies. There's no requirements for it. Is it going to help you? Absolutely. Is it going to help you in terms of designing a better product? Of course. It will also help your argument and your case in your regulatory submission to show that you went through some effort to get to the final product that you ended up with. Just showing, I equate this to showing your work when you're taking a math class. I had teachers who, they wanted me to show the work, and I have kids now, and I know if I just see their answer written there, I don't know how they came up with that answer. I don't even care if it's right. I'd rather just see the work because I know then how they're thinking about the process and how they came up with that. Of course, if they get it wrong, it also helps me to see, okay, where along the way did they misstep? And so that the regulatory reviewers are no different. Seeing that process is really helpful. And so if you're coming at the end stage here and you just want to run a formative study to kind of check another box, it does kind of defeat the purpose. But I think that is something that a lot of groups are focused on when they think of a formative study. They're thinking of this thing that is pretty much a validation or a summative study, but it's just called a formative. And so I think I'd want to show that there are other things that should be done aside from just getting right to the meat and potatoes and trying to do something that would be, your summative study, but calling it a formative. So a few that I want to focus on that I've seen be very helpful and cost effective, speeding up the process, even though it takes time always to do any sort of research project. It costs money, of course, but if done in cadence with the design and development process, it can just happen very smoothly. And we've seen this time and time again. Really, it doesn't derail the project in any way. It's just a great way to check how we're doing and if we're moving in the right direction, and little changes we should make to make sure we continue moving towards a product that is going to pass our summative or validation usability study. All right, so first I want to talk about participatory design. And this is something we've used a number of times, and I love it. It involves getting, well, let me go back here. It involves getting the people who use the product, who often are experts, healthcare professionals or even lay users who use a product for years and years. I mean, they are way more knowledgeable about this than we are. And so getting them involved in the design process, giving them some freedom to say, if you were to design your perfect X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, what would you have on it? What would it be? And so I want to give a case study. So this is a group we worked with, and they make a total artificial heart. And so in patients where they've experienced total heart failure, this total artificial heart comes in and is placed, the ventricles of the human heart are removed. They place in this mechanical heart, and it is the blood is pumped around the body through by air. So they carry around a pneumatic pump that pumps air into these, what they call drive lines, and those go into the artificial heart, and that pumps the body around. And this technology has been around. There's a number of groups that do it, but it has been fantastic. We worked with several of their patients who now have donor hearts. The idea here is this is a temporary solution. So if they have total heart failure, they can have the artificial heart for a month, a couple months, even a couple years sometimes, until a donor heart becomes available. So it's incredibly inspiring, and these folks who have had this are just awesome to talk to. Here's a picture of the kind of the artificial heart and that pump I was talking about that they carry around. And so we got involved in helping them design the new interface for this pump. So what would patients and clinicians see on the device that would allow them to, ensure everything's working properly, and then troubleshoot those things or interact with it, change parameters to make sure that that patient is, being perfused appropriately and really staying alive as a life-sustaining device as this is. So this is an example of, we started off kind of interviewing them, talking about their situation, how did they work with the patients, and then we gave them paper and some pencils, and we asked them to design for us what might be on, on the device. If they had their wishes, what would be on it? And these are some of the drawings that we came up with. I think these are drawings from 4 people. This one down here, not quite sure what they're trying to show, but you can see, they're definitely not designers. You're not going to hire these folks to, put artwork in your house, but you see some things that kind of come out, and many of these are kind of abbreviated, but these are related to the fill volumes. And here, simple, they're showing they want to see some of these graphs of how the heart is performing. Here as well, you can see fill volume again, and again, some graphs or what they call waveforms of how the heart is performing. Down here, you can see fill volume again, right and left fill, and some other things they might want. And these aren't all of what they drew, but these are just some examples. And you can see they aren't designing the interface for us. We're never going to take these and just put these right in, but we're able to take what they drew and kind of put together a conglomerate to say, okay, if we were designing these screens, is this kind of what they're looking for? And so we, made these a little bit more design worthy, if you will, and then put these on a simple tablet, kind of wireframe them up into a clickable wireframe, and took them right back out to some of the same healthcare providers and others. and had them perform tasks as if they were going to, work with a patient, change their beat rate, for example, and see how they performed. Did they understand the interface? Did they use it as we hoped they would? And so this is an example of getting their feedback, having them help us design it, and then putting that into a design, taking it back out and evaluating it to make sure that it's effective. So this is kind of participatory design along with some evaluative usability testing. Another example is eye tracking. I mentioned that briefly. And here's an example. We've done some work with patients who have hemophilia. For patients with hemophilia, they a few times a week will need to give themselves injections of factor VIII, which is the clotting agent that will help them clot. And this is a prophylactic technique, so that they will clot if something should occur that would cause them to bleed. And so we've done eye tracking on some of these folks. And when you talk about experts, these folks are definitely experts in giving these infusions. And when you put eye tracking on them, some of the things that come out we never really knew before. But this is an example here of a fixation, and you can see this is fixation number 502. And the line here is the saccade between where they were going. So the saccade is the eye movement, the quick eye movement, where you're actually blind, and we're all blind every time our eyes move until we fixate again. And so I have a video for this, but I think it was easier to show some pictures. So this represents where they're focusing, and you can see the size of the picture actually shows you how long the duration of that fixation. And what we noticed is that they were really focused. They had very heavy time of fixation on the amount of the dose. When they were watching it, go through the syringe, they weren't really paying attention to the injection site or anything else, but they were heavily focused on this, on the plunger itself, pushing the medication in. And what we learned is that this is largely because the medication is so expensive, to the tune of, I think, $3,000 every time they do an infusion. They're doing those 3 times a day. And so they want to make sure they're getting all the medication. And so there might be some areas to think about, okay, how do we make this an easier process, clearer process for them to understand that they're getting all the medication. Another technique is a label comprehension study, and this is one that I really like to advise people on who are going to do a summative study, a summative usability study, and they want to have a little bit of a backup. So as you know, in a summative usability study, we can't force people to use our instructions, to watch our training videos. We can't force them to do anything. They're kind of left to their own devices to figure out how to use the product. And I think a lot of times groups, and rightfully so, get really frustrated because people don't read the instructions. They spent time designing and creating and tried to make them clear. And they could fail tasks in the usability study because of this. And a label comprehension study is a really good way, and it can be a formative study. You can do them in large samples and actually call it kind of a label validation study. But it gives you this backup to where if you do have a summative usability study that doesn't have great results, well, you might have this label comprehension study where we've actually forced people to read the instructions, follow them step by step. And we can say, okay, if people read the instructions, we've shown through this usability study that they can use the product as intended. So it's a really helpful thing. And you wouldn't be surprised how many times we get these instructions in there and they're not that usable, right? They don't make sense. They confuse people sometimes even more than just the product itself. So that is it can be a helpful tool to make sure the instructions make sense, but also to kind of have in your back pocket to show a reviewer that you do have some data that show that the instructions are effective. We just can't force people to use them all the time. All right, last thing quickly, back to my case study here with the Syncardia total artificial heart. The drive lines that connect the heart to the patient are, it's not a fixed connection, so they can actually swap out the pump itself if they need to, if it breaks, malfunctions. And this process is incredibly difficult. It's done under high stress, sometimes with the patient himself lying on the floor because the heart is no longer the pump is out and they're not getting blood. And so it's a two-handed process currently because there's 2 ventricles, and the engineering of it just needed to be that way. There need to be two different pieces. And so you need two people to do it. They need to do it pretty much simultaneously, and it has to be done quickly. Any time that thing is disconnected, right, that person is not getting any air moving the blood around. So we lovingly call this the driver hot swap. I don't know how much that really is. It's not a technical term, but we knew this was going to be an issue, and so very early on, we worked up some prototypes and took this out to our studies where we were testing to see, can people use these our prototypes effectively. And you can tell this is a 3D printed model, very simple, C-clamped onto the table. But we introduced this one-handed approach to this problem, to this issue that used to be two-handed. And the lady you see here, whose hand is in the picture, she was the wife of a patient who was on the total artificial heart, who now has a donor heart and is doing great. But when she saw this, she cried. She broke down and just thought of the times that she had to, do that process while her husband had the total artificial heart, how stressful it was, and she just was grateful to see the progress in making a better solution, a truly safer solution. And even though this is just a simple, easy prototype, it allowed us to get early usability data to ensure that the hand fits in there. She's able to depress the button, disconnect it, connect the new one. And so I just wanted to show how easy and how simple that some of these prototypes can be that we're testing, but it helps us moving in that direction, knowing that we've kind of solved this issue. Now let's keep focusing on the others. And with that, I'll stop talking.
Great, thank you so much, Bryant. Great pictures, great cases, really interesting. So you can go on mute now, and we'll bring on our next presentation. And so the next, it's a tag team presentation we have for you next. We have Paul Charlebois, who's the ID and Human Factors Manager at Starfish with 18 years of experience in the field, 13 of them here at Starfish doing medical devices. Has a Bachelor's of Industrial Design from Carleton University in Ontario, Canada. And he's worked on dozens of medical devices. He's a big proponent of contextual research. He's flown around in air ambulances. He's gone to military bases. He's worked on GUIs. He's transported lungs. He's had a crazy career so far. And then Niall Redmond will be his partner in crime, who's a human factors engineer at Hamilton Medical in Switzerland, and with a Bachelor's of Industrial Design at National College of Art and Design in UK, with 14 years of experience. And he formerly worked for Starfish, and I believe they're going to share a couple of case studies of different projects they worked on together. Take it away, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Scott. So thank you, everyone. So I think, having seen Virginia and Brian's presentations, we can really understand how important it is to do human factors as part of your holistic sort of product development for medical device process. And Niall and I are just going to talk about 3 points that we felt will help to reinforce this importance. And we're going to reinforce those with some case study examples. So point number 1, there we go. Expose your prototypes to all actors, not just the ones you think are important. So when we speak of actors, we think about users or humans that interact with a system, so with a device or a system of devices. So let's say you're working on a surgical device. You think, okay, well, who am I going to get for feedback? I'm going to need some KOLs saying, well, I'm going to get a surgeon to weigh in, and I'll probably largely source my usability from them. They're probably the ones that are going to use it the most. And so that's going to save me some time and money over the course of the development process. But the trouble is that the surgeon only spends about 30 seconds to a minute with the device. And it's actually the circulating nurse is the one that spends 10 to 15 minutes setting it up. I mean, we've seen this time and time again. And so it's really important that in scenarios like this, that you really actually get a lot of that feedback from those sort of actors that are not necessarily seen as sort of the centerpiece, but they really actually support the whole usability journey of this device in the system. So an example would be we were working on a device a few years back, and so this device had to spend some time in DOR. You can kind of see there, it's a little bit fuzzy, but the key piece was that we knew we had to get that interface with the surgeons. We knew we really needed to kind of understand that, but it was easy to get distracted with that because they had all these sort of requirements, all these things that they wanted to do with it, but there was this whole other chain of custody of users that had to be considered in addition to them, even though they may not have been the ones that were sort of hands inside the device kind of thing, right? And so what we discovered quickly was that there was this whole other group, and this group was very multifaceted. This was probably one of the projects I worked on that had a pretty wildly multifaceted group of users. And more importantly, not just the users, but also the varying environments that the system had to kind of be journeyed through in order for it to complete its usability process. So, a few examples here. So we knew this device had to be used. It had to sort of travel on an ambulance at times. Sometimes it would have to travel in a taxi. Sometimes it would have to travel on a private jet. I'd never been on a private jet in my whole life. And as it turns out, they're tiny. I didn't realize that private jets were so little. And people who are over 6 feet tall, they don't really travel comfortably in private jets. But what that meant for our device was we realized, wait a minute, this thing is going to have to fit in this super tiny space in a sort of compact format. But then the surgeons were like, no, we want it to be tall so that we can kind of interact with it. And so we thought, okay, so the device has got to be little sometimes, big other times. And so this is really critical information that you want to get this information as fast as you can, because getting this once you're, say, at the alpha level or something, that's a hugely problematic and expensive problem. So having done that sort of early days with our sort of wooden mock-ups and so on, we knew that we could set the stage for the rest of the engineering team to help kind of set the pace and make this thing a successful product. And so you can see that was a really good example of how usability early on in really kind of sets the pace and for you to get a successful submission to regulatory and get a really usable product that everybody can use. So second point is cutting corners in usability testing when you're in a rush is a bad idea. Now, I think after the last few presentations you've seen, you think, well, obviously, but quite often we're stuck in a situation where we just need to go fast. And so you just look at any kind of place where you can cut corners. Last year, we worked on a ventilator. I think a lot of you are probably aware of that. And, as you can imagine, there was a sense of urgency to getting these ventilators out in the field. There was a lot of people dying that really needed them. And one of the things that we wanted to do, though, because Starfish is a full program provider, is we really wanted to make sure that the usability of whatever we came up with was really considered, so that we don't end up putting these things out in the field. We knew that the users that these were going to sometimes might not actually be RTs with 20 years of experience because of this so-called stadium medicine that this might actually go into, because there's going to be such a huge tidal wave. There was sort of a forecasted huge tidal wave of patients that were maybe going to come through. So it had to be simple, but it had to be really, it had to be as full-featured as possible and really easy to use. So when we did the original prototyping, so you can see here, it's sort of in our garages and stuff because we had to work from home. So there was all these COVID challenges, but we still knew that wasn't going to be enough. And we're actually going to have to get this out and source it with KOLs. Here's an example of something that we actually discovered. So the window on the left and the window on the right, they're the same interface. The one on the left was what it was originally. And then after we made a modification. So there's a very subtle change between the two of them. I'm sure right now everyone is going, where's Waldo on this thing, and trying to figure out what's the difference. And so I'll explain it. So the top left is your patient data. So this is real live information that you're getting at all times from the ventilator. So there's three sort of key things that you want to be looking at there. One is the pressure, the second is the flow, and the third is the PEEP. And what the PEEP is that's just sort of like this remaining pressure that's always in the system, so that when the machine exhales for the user, it doesn't bring it back down to atmospheric pressure. This is because of the way that we ventilate a patient using a machine. So what we had thought, so when we interviewed the users originally, they said, okay, this is how we do it. So we want the patient data to be portrayed exactly as you've shown it. But then as we set alarms, because the first thing we do is we set alarms so this thing doesn't light up like a Christmas tree as soon as I start using it, is I set the PEEP first. So I'm going to set my high PEEP, my low PEEP. Then I'm going to set the pressure, and then I'm going to set my tidal volume, and so on and so forth. So we thought, makes sense. We're going to go left to right, and this is how they're going to do it. And then we're gonna send this out for usability testing. But what we discovered was actually that while that made sense from a heuristics perspective, so when I speak heuristics, I mean these sort of really good design practices that we just apply to everything that we do before we take it to usability testing with KOLs. Our heuristics told us that really worked, but when we got to usability, the users were actually having trouble because what was happening is, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but you can see on the one on the left that the pressure is on the left, PEEP's on the right. But if you look at the alarms, the PEEP is on the left and the pressure's on the right. And what was happening is users were actually getting it mixed up because the human brain is always trying to make patterns and pattern recognition and just trying to like make things line up and so on. And so what users were doing is they were going to set their PEEP, but they were actually touching the wrong knob. So even though from a workflow perspective that made sense, it didn't actually make sense. And so we ended up having to swap them out afterwards, which fortunately wasn't too difficult because all we had to do was print a new label and then switch it in hardware, in the software of the system. But it's a really good example of where heuristics really kind of dovetail nicely into usability testing, and why it's really critical that you still get on the grounds with that usability testing. So COVID provided some challenges and some opportunities. So we had to do some usability testing, and we also knew that, I'll just move the slide to the next one, that at the same time we were going to have to be able to protect our participants while making sure that we didn't sort of encourage this production of test artifacts. And we're actually going to cover that in the third point in a minute. But so that brought opportunities in that we knew that we found ways that we could work creatively to get a larger audience, to get the right audience in to do some sort of person-in-person training or testing. But it also allowed us to sort of perfect our online and web sort of usability sourcing with different users. That's actually how we discovered the one for the interface. And it was something that we weren't doing as much before because we didn't have to. We did it more in person. But because we were able to get such a wider audience, cast a wider net, we were able to get more data points, and it actually helped us make a better device. You can see another example here of in-person testing. So we had this PEEP holder. Hold on, I'm going faster than the slides. The PEEP holder on the left there. So you can see there's a little valve here, the blue and the orange. And so we made this little tray for that to rest in. And so in the rush of things, we thought, well, that should be good enough. That'll hold the device. It'll work. We don't have to worry about it getting dirty while it's getting used. But what we discovered during use was that because of the way that the machine works, it's always pumping and jerking. And so it would actually slowly ride its way off of the tray. And then as soon as it dropped, the line would actually unhook itself. And then your pilot line and then the machine would throw a fault, obviously, because the pilot line got disconnected. So what we did is we realized that we needed to do some prototyping. So the top right, on the second image, you could see that we made this quick little bracket that would allow the tube to sort of snap into place. And then this sort of was a quick modification to it. It didn't mean that we had to change really much in terms of the overall layout of the system, and that was really beneficial because a lot of the parts were already in production, and that was critical to us because, as you can imagine, we were moving as agile and as fast as we could through the program.
Okay, so yes, the high fidelity environments and test setups reduce the likeliness of test artifacts. The test artifact is a huge problem that we encounter a lot with testing in general, and part of the reason for that is, so I've got to keep my voice down a little bit. Part of the reason for that is that as you set up an environment, so basically you're testing three pillars within your test. You've got your device, you've got your users, and you've got your use environments. And a key component of that is the environment. And there are a lot of test artifacts that come about from the way in which you test something. And so if you have a low fidelity environment, such as the one that we've got here, people end up not being in the situation or focusing on the device rather than focusing on the scenario that they're trying to solve. So they, from a formative evaluation perspective, this is where you really get the great information from users, they start to really think about the device and the scenario and how they would evolve the design, I guess. And then from a summative perspective, you've got a lot of risks that you would have put into that are very low probability, like maybe 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million, and you're never going to see them. But if you focus very finely on the device, because you're not in the scenario where you would be, you quite often see these popping up, and then they're very hard to mitigate or rationalize through root cause, or because it's just a test artifact due to the low fidelity environment. The other thing that you see a lot of when you've got low fidelity environments is people thinking that there's a trick question, or so they start to think outside the box as to what you're asking them for, rather than just doing what they would normally do, and we observe it and then report on that, or simply just skipping things altogether. So like I was saying, the last slide, there was that low fidelity, and then here we've got this really high fidelity environment, and like I was saying, it's that ability to get people into the mindset, put them in the actual scrubs, like you see here. Like once they're in that mindset, and you really start to see a reduction in the test artifact that comes out of the testing. And it's, as I said, it's a really hard piece to mitigate or to rationalize. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's it. I was going to talk a bit more about the first few slides there, but I think you got through them quite quickly.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Niall and Paul. Thanks for bearing with us with our technical challenges. It's all gone very smoothly. So we're at the point where we're going to go through some questions. So if the other two speakers can come back on again, we'll see whether we get echoes and whether people have to mute. And if any of our audience members want to ask specific questions, you can go to the Q&A tab and pop your questions in there. I can't promise I'll ask them verbatim, but we'll definitely consider them all. Can you talk about any other insights you've gained from eye tracking? And that seems like a pretty interesting technology that I don't believe we've used that for our products.
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
All right. Yeah, so eye tracking can actually tell us a lot. I mentioned the part about being able to see what people attend to, but we can actually see through pupil dilation and some of those lengths of fixation and returns to things. We can actually get a sense of cognitive workload as well. So if you see people reading, we don't read left to right like we think we might, right? If you look at the eye movements and people as they read, they're really skipping around and just kind of sampling bits, but we can somehow read the information. And if you see people, reading information, but they're going back in the sentence, if their patterns are very consistently moving backwards and forward and back and forth, that's an indication that they're not understanding it. And so there are actually analysis programs that can pick those things up even better than we could if we just watched all the video. And so that will give you a sense that maybe that information is not comprehensible. And the other is pupil dilation as well. Our pupils dilate when we are excited, and really it's to take more information in. If we like something, we want to take more of that in. But that also is an indication that we are trying to take more information in because we're confused and we're trying to make sense of it. So these data that come from the eye tracker can be incredibly helpful. They also can be a little bit convoluted too. So to say that pupil dilation means we like it, but it also could mean we're confused by it. It's important to combine that with something else as well. So maybe we'll combine some self-report as well to say, hey, we noticed here, you were really paying attention to this. What can you tell us what you were thinking there? What was going through your mind? And that will help us to make sense of, okay, was that what we see in the biometric data, was that related to a positive or a negative?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Any examples of when corners were cut and that might have been a bad idea without revealing any special secrets? You're gonna have to unmute, Paul.
Yeah.
Sure.
In fact, now and I actually go ahead now.
Certainly come across corners being cut on a numerous occasions. There's always a rush to get to the market, which is a bit of a, it can be a bit of a sore spot when it comes to usability, because sometimes it's the thing that gets cut out first. And so it's and oftentimes the most costly mistake, because then they end up having to redo things. So a great example of corners being cut is not identifying training early enough. It's really about identifying things and getting things to tested at an early enough stage, so that you're not really just trying to do your initial testing during a summative evaluation or leading up to it, where you're trying to make last minute changes and ends up being quite costly.
Yeah, a couple examples. Years ago, we worked on this Intraosseous Infuser. So it's a device that you stick into your sternum in order to put a tube that you can then give fluids. Goes through the marrow instead of through the venous process, and it's just a different way to give fluids to people. We had this mandate to make this device smaller and lighter, which we did. And it worked great on the bench, but the client didn't. We didn't do as much usability testing. We weren't able to do as much usability testing as should have been done before it went sort of to the kind of the beta testing. And so what we realized at that point was that it worked perfect when the thing was going up and down, like on a machine. Because we were using load cells and stuff to do all the calculations. Everything worked really well. But as soon as you add any kind of lateral movement, which when you're in a helo or a military situation, there's all kinds of stuff going on, it would cause it to actually buckle. And so we did actually change the design, and we added some extra stability to it afterwards. But usability probably would have caught that earlier. And this was back in the early days. It wasn't even mandatory to do any kind of usability back then. We're talking about over a decade ago. There's been so much that's happened since then in terms of the modernization of this. But I always think about that when I think, oh man, really, really wish we would have just had that opportunity, and I'm sure Bryant's got like a million examples of that too. But it is one of those situations where it would have been way cheaper had we made that change beforehand. We were able to make what we call tool-safe changes to it, which means that we weren't having to weld the injection molding tool. We can just cut it some more. But just keeping an eye on that kind of thing is pretty critical.
Great, thank you, Paul. I see Virginia's coming back, but while we're waiting for her, then Bryant, we had a question from Srikar Kothamachu relating to how do you deal with contradictory inputs? And things are confusing in the land of human factors, right?
So contradictory inputs confuse.
The literal question was, during formative summative usability studies, if we get contradictory inputs from user groups, any suggestions on how to address them?
Yes, thank you. And that happens all the time, right? You do a study, you bring in 10 people, 5 people say they like the red one, 5 people say they like the blue one, and you're like, well, what do we do with that? That's it might be in something really important. So I think we have some comfort, I guess, that we can take in medical devices that we're going to be focused on safety first and foremost. And so if we we're not usually going to get contradictions in terms of whether they can do it or whether it's safe or not. It might be more on the preferential things. And so I really think we can kind of offset the preferential or the contradictory statements by looking at performance. And that's one of the things that usability testing gives us, is it gives us some way of quantifying rather than just relying on, okay, is this more usable? Is this better? Do you like this more? We actually can have some quantitative measures and performance data to say, hey, this one performs better, or maybe they both perform equally well. At that point we feel good about both. But that definitely happens, and it is I think we often deal with that, and especially, designers go crazy sometimes when they see people just saying the exact opposite things from each other.
Great. On a sort of somewhat related note, the sort of the difference between what people say they'll do and what they actually do, and how do you deal with that when your product hasn't been developed yet?
Yeah, no, that's a great one. So often when we think about design, we'd love to see what people say. So right, getting their interview data. What they do is actually observing them do it. And then we've got the other part of what they make, right? So seeing them in this participatory design, or giving them a chance to be designers in it. So yeah, what they say and what they do, I think we just can't rely on one. We can't strictly rely on focus groups or interviews. We've even seen people come to us and say, yeah, we ran a usability study, and it's a list of questions, right? They had people interact with the product, get trained on it, and then what they're considering the usability study is a list of questions of, was this easy? Did you have difficulties with this? And that's only half the story, because we definitely know that what we say and what we do are not always the same thing. Sometimes they align. We definitely can't rely on just one.
Great, thank you. So I wonder, Paul and Niall, you could talk about any sort of surprises that when you added, maybe one point of view brought a whole new insight to the problem that you.
Sure. Are you going to say something now? No? Okay.
No, I was going to ask him to repeat it.
Say any surprise that came up through your formative work that really affected maybe somebody from a surprising point of view or a different user than you're expecting?
Well, formatives are brilliant because they're full of surprises. There's every time you think that something is easy, it's actually far more complicated. Like a funny example is there was this charger that it's not exactly what you're asking, but it's a funny example anyway. There was this little USB stick that would go into the side of the computer, you know what it is, and then the device had to be connected to the computer via this USB. And then the device also had to be charged. And we had this really old user group, which was in the 70s and 80s, and there was a home use device, and they then had to plug it into the wall to charge the device. How do you do that? You plug that USB into the wall socket and then stick it into the wall. And they couldn't figure it out. There was no way that you can't stick a USB into the wall. And they went through every single thing, and I mean, like 90% failed, and it was because they couldn't figure that the technology was too new for them, that a wall wart was how you charge the device. So it's kind of, but I mean, like, there's endless. I hear really funny stories about like one of the PIC line, for a central line, and it was a new device that was being developed. It was a syringe so the dummy was lying on the bed, the mannequin, and the nurse was brought in and said, okay, so I'd like you to give this with no explanation, just here's this huge long syringe. I'd like you to deliver this to the patient. She was like, I know this is easy. Thought it was adrenaline or something, and stuck it straight into the patient's chest cavity. And they went, all right, we need to rethink about this. This is crazy. We're meant to give that in the PIC coming into the arm. So yeah, there's lots of great examples of crazy things that can happen in formative studies.
I actually think one really funny one is, Niall, you were the one that actually told me about this years ago. There was, you were doing some cleaning testing. So there's a device that needed to be cleaned, and we had a cleaning protocol, told our users, this is how you clean it. And so there was like very clear instructions on how to clean the thing. And so they would go and do the cleaning, but they would cut corners during the actual testing, and they're like, well, I wouldn't do that way. This is just how I do it. It was amazing, because they're like, wow, they're not even following the instructions. Like, it's too strong for them. They have to do it their way. It's so insightful to get that kind of thing at the formative level, because you're like, doesn't matter how good your instructions are, forget it. They're not going to follow them, throw them away. So
that's right.
Very interesting. Okay, I think we're kind of drawing to the close. I will, unfortunately, we are unable to get Virginia back and all of her insights and 30 years of experience, but I'll give the last question to Bryant. So we had Carmen Chacon and asked a question about dealing with usability testing under COVID. How have you managed to adapt to test things when you can't see people face to face?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think Niall touched on some of that. So we've just, and Paul mentioned this too, there's been kind of some difficulties, but there's also been some opportunities that have come from it. So we've seen that we can do more remote sessions through medium like this, being able to see people interacting with certain types of interfaces. So yeah, we've definitely implemented that. And we've done a fair amount of in-person usability testing as well, just implementing, safety measures to ensure, social distancing and mask wearing. We've done some where we've had moderators in the room with participants, others where we've had the participants on their own, and we can observe them through, really good cameras. So we've just kind of adapted, and I know working with Niall too on some stuff, just really trying to be careful and keep everyone safe, right? Our staff and the participants themselves. But yeah, we've still been able to do, remote and in person throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
This is just one of those examples where necessity is the mother of invention. Is like it just makes it so clear, right?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Perfect. And with that, I think we'll call our session done for today. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. If you want to go to our website, here's the link. It should be posted within a few days here, and you can catch any finer points